This was bound to happen to compare a Casagrandes episode with a Clinkin McCloud episode. Technically the second, considering that the Halloween episode centered around Lincoln and Clyde, but in reality, this episode is really an example of why people do not like Clinkin McCloud episodes, and I totally understand where they're coming from. And judging by the thumbnail of this video, you can instantly tell that the Casagrandes episode, the Taco the Town, is a better episode over Tough Cookies. But since that this is an analysis, I have to do my thing. This may be weird to think about since you think I'm comparing Lincoln Loud and Clyde, who is making the cookies, in the same way as Rosa, who's an experienced chef making the tacos, but in reality that's not the main focus, because the main focus is mainly two groups starting a business that gives them more money, which is reaching them on a gold mine, all the while that some of the characters are less experienced on handling a business. Granted, it may be difficult to think about, but I'm not including Rosa since Hector is a main character in Taco the Town. After many people have eaten Clyde's cookies, this convinced Lincoln and Clyde to start their own cookie making business. In all honesty, knowing full well that these two characters would do anything in order to get some extra cash, I'm honestly don't blame him, but that doesn't automatically mean that the episode is any better. In the Casagrandes episode, Hector decides to use Rosa's tacos to sell, which leads them to success when it comes to money, but this also makes so many changes in the Mercado. In all honesty, both episodes with similar themes is enough to make you understand onto why the Casagrandes episode is better over the Loud House episode, mainly the fact that even if Hector is only using Rosa to make the tacos, you can totally understand that if he was making the tacos, he will end up like Lincoln and Clyde. And I'm being perfectly honest that the biggest problem of Tough Cookies is the fact that with it being a Clinkin McCloud episode, this is obviously one of the weakest episodes I've seen involving Clinkin McCloud. Mainly the fact that knowing forward that they're trying way too hard to hammer in on running a business is way more difficult, which is one thing, but considering that Lincoln's sisters barely do anything in this episode, just goes to show that they're trying way too hard to hammer in the message of running a business. But considering that Clyde is mostly a chef and the fact that they're trying way too hard to make Clyde in the predicament that Lincoln is in, I don't even understand onto why they're hammering in on this running a business is difficult, because upon watching this episode, all the while watching the Loud House's critics' review of this episode, it just made me convinced that this episode instantly made the situation way more difficult than it has been, because as far as I'm concerned, Clyde would easily be able to run a business knowing full well that in the season 6 episode, he was willing to go to Paris in order to start a new life. Granted, it didn't change the fact that his friends got away, but I'll discuss that in the future. You see, whenever I watch these episodes from seasons 4 through present, it's not because of the fact that the issues are still there. It's just that there are more issues that I keep looking at, mainly at the fact that the characters don't take alternative routes. In episodes like this, Clyde is just basically Lincoln's less man that can't be able to think of a different alternative. Which is why I think that the reason onto why Lincoln has attached to Clyde on being Clinkin McCloud is because Lincoln can't be able to rely on A1, especially since that this is in season 4, after season 3 where there was a lot of development between him and his sisters. This just goes to show that whenever I look at this episode being part of season 4, and the fact that it's a Clinkin McCloud episode, nearly every single character is difficult to like, but also difficult to hate. But more on that later. When it comes to the Casagrandes episode, it's no surprise that Rosa is a better chef than Clyde. Mainly the fact that she instantly makes so many different foods, and regardless if Clyde makes different foods, there's literally no competition that tacos is way more popular than the cookies. Because as far as I'm concerned, even if I'm not a fan of tacos, even especially since I don't like them, I can totally understand as to why it's one of the most popular foods that people are willing to have. In Tough Cookies, the customers never fight over cookies, but in this episode, Taco the Town, everyone, mainly the customers, are obsessed with Rosa's tacos. It really feels like that this episode is just showcasing how valuable tacos are when it comes to the customers fighting over it. And to be honest, the running gag of customers fighting over tacos is really humorous. And considering of how much that this episode has showcases the Mercado changing over time for the wars for Hector, I can totally understand that Hector is struggling with major changes in order to make some extra money. When it comes to Rosa, regardless if you would understand that she's only doing this for her family and the fact that she's willing to make some major sacrifices, you can totally understand that Hector is willing to make things right for Rosa by being in her shoes, or in her chanclas, if that actually makes sense. Because as far as I'm concerned, the similarities of what Hector does with just like Lincoln and Clyde in Tough Cookies is mainly being in Rosa's position. Mainly being the mother figure for the Casagrandes. You know, considering that Hector is the father who isn't smart, in fact, it's basically him being dumbed down for the sake of comedy, I'm gonna be really honest with you. There were a few moments that made me cringe from him, but at the same time, he isn't that terrible. And just seeing him just trying to be like Rosa just goes to show that he is willing to make money by using Rosa's tacos. And considering that he isn't technically using her completely by manipulating her, it really feels like that he's just trying to do the right thing in order to make Rosa make tacos in order to make a huge gold mine. And let's be real, they kept a lot of money even after all this. Granted, Hector ended up using the money for Rosa, but at the same time, he's Rosa's husband. To be real, the fact that he didn't want the Mercado to be a taco restaurant just goes to show that the skyrocketing popularity of Rosa's tacos can instantly change a lot of the Casagrandes' lives, including Hector's. So, if you were ever in Hector's position where you actually relate on how he's just trying to at least do the right thing by being in Rosa's position, then you can totally understand where he's coming from. But when it comes to Lincoln and Clyde, it didn't even give me the message of how running a business is difficult, because regardless if they were greedy, all I can think of is the odds are just way too harsh towards them. In all honesty, I would understand that these characters have flaws and they do make terrible mistakes that is some worth calling out on, but in all honesty, whenever I look at these two characters without the presence of all of Lincoln's sisters, all I can think of is, am I supposed to get into the down-to-earth elements in this episode? Because there are no fancy elements in this episode whatsoever, and the fact that this is a down-to-earth episode just makes it difficult for me to understand the struggle between Lincoln and Clyde. Let me tell you, since this was around the point where the characters do the same mistakes as before, mainly Lisa looking through everywhere, including Clyde's house, it just really feels like that this episode is really insulting the intelligence of the viewers. Because let me tell you, House Flip did it much more worse, and once I get to that, you can totally understand onto why that episode instantly triggers me the most. But when it comes to this episode, it really feels like that anything that happens before this season means nothing. Because it's just really irritating that these characters barely learn anything, and when Lincoln and Clyde are being in this position, it really feels like that when they learn that running the business is difficult, it's mainly the fact that the odds are just way too against them. Now, you may be saying, why couldn't Lincoln and Clyde go to Lin So since that he's a professional chef? To be perfectly honest, I think that the reason onto why they didn't do this idea is because they just want to make Lincoln and Clyde deal with running the business much more difficult. I'm being really serious. Like, the only way for Lincoln and Clyde's deal with Lincoln's father on selling cookies in his shop is a bad idea is if they did the route of what Taco the Town did by turning the Mikado into a taco restaurant, which doesn't work when you take the consideration that Clyde and Lincoln are making cookies and not an actual meal, like Lin So has been making. And I'm sorry, but what Lin So said about enjoy being a kid while you can, because when you get older, you can understand how difficult it is, but what Lincoln and Clyde went through by making cookies with the odds against them just goes to show that it's difficult to take his words seriously. He may be a chef, but at the same time, Lincoln and Clyde were selling cookies, not different types of snacks. Don't get me wrong, I understand it's difficult to make cookies, but at the same time, I haven't even gotten to Lincoln's friends in this episode yet. If there's one thing I can appreciate Taco the Town is the fact that it actually feels like the characters are working together. Like, Carl is just trying to do some entertainment, all the while that Bobby is also trying to run a business with the tacos. So it really feels like that if the Loud House took inspiration from this episode, regardless if that episode came out before this, where the Loud sisters are willing to help Lincoln and Clyde with the cookies, then I can totally understand that it will probably work out in the end, because Lincoln is willing to give his friends money even while working, and the fact that he's going to do the same if his sisters are willing to help, then in all honesty, it really goes to show that Lincoln isn't that completely selfish. I mean, you can argue that he can be greedy, but at the same time, for a kid who is 11 years old, he's literally desperate to do anything in order to get some kind of attention. But after watching the Loud House movie, and regardless if Lincoln may be special in the family, it still didn't grab my attention or got me invested, because as far as I'm concerned, there was a reason onto why my Lincoln Loud video was 7 hours long, almost, but at the same time, there was a reason onto why I made that video longer than it needed to be. When it comes to Lincoln's friends, even if they were willing to help, it just goes to show that it's difficult to understand that the predicament that Lincoln and Clyde in are just getting a lot more complicated. Like, it's one thing that Lincoln had ran out of butter because he doesn't have much in his allowance, but when it comes to the other characters, mainly Zach doing the taste tester, I understand that he's just trying to make sure that the cookies aren't that deadly or poison, even if that doesn't make any sense considering that none of the characters in this episode use poison in the food. I'm starting to convince that they clearly try to hammer in the message on running the business is difficult. I understand it's annoying for me to say it, and I understand that the down-to-earth elements of running the business is supposed to be important in this episode, but I've already pointed out all the issues involving Lincoln and Clyde running the business due to the odds against them, because the final nail in the coffin with that argument is the fact that once Stella and the others are done being employees, she mentioned that they had to do the history projects. And this hasn't been brought up until now. And in all honesty, if it was mentioned earlier on, then I can totally understand that what Lincoln and Clyde are doing is not really a good idea, because I can understand that they're completely ignoring what's really important rather than just making cookies in order to run a business. That way I can totally understand why running the business can't be complicated, but since it's mentioned now, and the ending of the episode just includes Zach eating Lincoln and Clyde's project, just shows little meaning of how valuable a lesson like this really is. Because in the ending of Back in Black, it kind of makes sense that Lincoln's project means nothing because Lucy was the main character of that episode. Granted, you can make the argument that Lincoln's sisters were being selfish towards Lincoln when it comes to wrecking his project for the sake of Rusty's little brother to come over, but in all honesty, it really felt like that they actually had a reason to help out Lucy regardless if they were being rude towards Lincoln. And in all honesty, I would prefer that moment over the moment where they had no part of helping out Lincoln in order to make the odds difficult against him and Clyde. I'm just gonna be really honest with you, this episode alone just showcases onto why this is one of my least favorite Clinking McCloud episodes, because it's a Clinking McCloud episode with the odds being way too harsh towards the two. I would have understand that Lincoln isn't always the best at everything, especially since that his nickname is Man with a Plan, but in all honesty, when we don't even see the aftermath of their customers eating the cookies that are terribly baked, then I honestly don't know what to expect other than you're losing the meaning of Lincoln and Clyde learning a lesson of running a business. With that out of the way, let me tell you the meaning of Talk of the Town. If anything, it made me somewhat feel sympathy towards Hector. Like, you can totally understand that he's just trying to make things right for the family while trying to be like Rosa, all the while that his wife does all the work when it comes to making money. And I can totally understand that he's willing to make some major sacrifices, but at the same time, he just misses out the Mikado. If anything, the Mikado being part of Hector's personality traits really goes to show that he has positives that somewhat overweigh his negatives, and I can instantly tell that this episode alone is pretty much the best episode we're ever going to have from Hector. Granted that there are other episodes that may have a slight improvement over this episode, but after watching this episode, it made me understand of what running a business will affect the lives of the Casagrandes. Like, regardless if Rosa made the running the business thing much more easily compared to Lincoln and Clyde, I can totally understand that the meaning behind what this episode is trying to do made me appreciate it. Granted, I can understand that this ending is a lot more different compared to Tough Cookies, but on the other hand, it's much more better. So, in all honesty, Talk of the Town is the superior episode over Tough Cookies. I don't have anything else to say about these two episodes, so if you're thinking I'm gonna be comparing the Lin Soul episodes with a Rosa episode since that both are chefs, I'm still taking my time with it, and if it doesn't happen, I apologize. It's just becoming a lot more difficult to find more episodes that are similar with each other, especially since I've been going on a streak on uploading multiple episodes centering around the Lighthouse vs. Casagrandes since this year began. Keep in mind, it could happen, but at the same time, it won't. I give Tough Cookies a 4.5 out of 10, while Talk of the Town gets an 8 out of 10.